Outraged residents of Uvalde, Texas, confronted members of the city's school board Monday, nearly 2 months after an 18-year-old gunman shot dead 19 fourth graders and their 2 teachers at Robb Elementary School. Speakers at the meeting included 17-year-old Jasmine Cazares. Her 9-year-old sister Jackie died in the shooting.
What are you guys going to do to make sure I don't have to watch my friends die? What are you going to do to make sure I don't have to wait 77 minutes bleeding out on my classroom floor just like my little sister did? I know there's nothing you can do to bring my sister back, but maybe, just maybe, if you do something to change this, you can prevent the next family from losing their child.
The school board's meeting came a day after a Texas House panel released a damning report on the response of local, state, federal law enforcement to the school massacre. The report found officers committed, quote, systemic failures and egregiously poor decision-making. They found that nearly 400 officers, 400, rushed to the school, but it took them more than an hour to confront the gunman. Investigators found officers, quote, failed to prioritize saving innocent lives over their own safety. The report also revealed the gunman had earned the nickname school shooter in the months before he attacked the elementary school. Daniel Myers, a pastor in Uvalde, also addressed the school board Monday.
Do you want to bring healing to this community, to these families? I would suggest that you, the chief of police, Uvalde chief of police, the Uvalde Sheriff's Office, and McCraw, and all those other law enforcement agencies who are in that hall, all come up here and tell these people, these families, we failed you. We failed you.
Other speakers during Monday's school board meeting included Tina Quintanilla and her 8-year-old daughter, who was friends with many of the victims of the massacre.
My daughter has something to say.
This was the last dress that all my friends saw me on. Most of those kids were my friends, and that's not good. And I don't want to go to your guys' school if they don't have protection.
And she's encouraging for her friends not to go to school, too.
This all comes as Texas Governor Greg Abbott is facing criticism for not attending one of the 21 victims' funerals of the massacre. We're joined now by Texas State Senator Roland Gutierrez. His district includes Uvalde. State Senator Gutierrez, welcome back to Democracy Now! There's so much to ask you about. I mean, first of all, the fact that almost 400 police officers of every level, federal, state, local, school officers, it turns out were on the site right after, minutes after, the gunman entered that school. Can you talk about what you found further, this report, and what you are calling for?
Well, thank you, Amy, for having me on the show. What I'm calling for and have been calling for since the third day is for Greg Abbott to bring us back into the legislature, to bring us back to call a special session that is a specific requirement that only he can do, the specific enumerated power that only he can do, so that we can change the age limit to go out and access or buy an AR-15. You have to be 21 to buy a handgun, but you can be 18 years old and walk into a gun shop like this young man did, like it was a 7-Eleven buying a Slurpee. In Parkland, it took Rick Scott, another Republican governor, 21 days to do that. Here we are, 26 days away from school starting, and Greg Abbott has refused to do even the most conservative of things, the one thing that could have avoided this from happening.
And Senator Gutierrez, I wanted to ask you, in terms of this report, we all recall how a lot of the initial blame was placed on the the chief of the small school district police on the scene of the Uvalde school district. What does the report confirm for you in terms of your suspicions about the failures at all these other levels of law enforcement?
Well, Juan, I mean, it confirms exactly that. All of my suspicions from the beginning, everything that I had said, excuse me, from day one, was that there was systemic failure, human error, communications errors. We didn't have a working radio. The radio system, every officer that was in that building couldn't hear the 911 dispatch calls, couldn't hear each other talk to one another. It just wasn't even functioning. It was a chaotic scene from the beginning, which is what I had imagined. And certainly that report confirms that. The one redeeming quality of this report is that we don't have any more finger pointing. We've had the Department of Public Safety since day three, since day one, begin to point the finger at different law enforcement agencies. First to the local school cop. No doubt he erred, no doubt. Then the school teacher, who did nothing wrong, but she was lambasted for a week for putting a rock on a door, which she didn't do, propping it open. Then, they went after the Uvalde Police Department. Clearly, they erred as well. But as I have said from the beginning, each and every law enforcement unit that was in that hallway, there was 12 DPS troopers in that hallway, in and out, walking around, milling around. Each and every one of those entities is responsible for violating the active shooter protocols. And someone needs to be held accountable.
Now, also, you've suggested that the roots of the problems and the failures here go more to Governor Abbott's policies, especially in terms of rural districts of the state. Could you expound on that?
We have a system failure begins somewhere, and I think that it begins with neglect in Texas. We have been asking in rural Texas for improved Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi was mentioned as a key component as to why communications weren't happening in an effective way, not just the radios, but basically teachers being able to access the Raptor system properly, being able to communicate well enough. We have a system in rural Texas where this governor has been asked for the last 7 years to fix the actual police radio system, which DPS uses the most of. He spent $10 billion on Operation Lone Star. Excuse me, something's come over me this morning. $10 billion on Operation Lone Star. And we can't go out and spend $10 million to fix the radio system that this community asked for the last 7 years. DPS, again, is the biggest user of that radio system. As much as this was system failure, it was a story of neglect. Greg Abbott likes to talk about mental health. We'll fund mental health properly. I had a farmer mental health bill last session that the Republican Congress in the Senate killed. They wouldn't let it out of committee. I was able to add it on to a bill as an amendment, and it got on, and we were able to get a little bit more funding for rural Texas. But it is a drop in the bucket compared to what we truly need to do. So if we're going to talk about these other ancillary things and not talk about the key component, which is guns, fund those things properly, fund school hardening, fund mental health, and also talk about guns. The one thing that this governor and every Republican in that building refuses to talk about, even the people on that committee. You notice that there wasn't a prop, not once, of an AR-15. There wasn't all that much mention about guns themselves and the power and the devastation of this particular gun. All you need to do is look at the video, and there's still one missing. There's still one very key important video which shows construction material flying out of that room over officers' heads.
Senator, I wanted to go back to Governor Abbott. You just mentioned Operation Lone Star. I think this is absolutely key to address, because some might think this is a remote city that, just couldn't deal with what had taken place. In fact, millions and millions of dollars have been poured into the militarization of the police, of the Border Patrol, to deal with the border. And when you have governors like Abbott continually saying, you know, a bad guy with a gun has to be confronted by a good guy with a gun, well, from his perspective, there were almost 400 of them there, and none of that happened. Can you talk about what this means, the level of weapons and military-grade equipment that's there, not to mention the officers, and yet this happens to a local community in the middle of it?
Yes, Amy. So for those that don't know what Operation Lone Star is, this is Greg Abbott's seminal task force to fight this invading horde along the border. You know, the immigrants that he thinks are just the boogeyman that he's created. Now, let's be clear. That's the federal government's job. They're doing a decent job. They're doing what they can. And the incrementational increase of law enforcement by the Department of Public Safety, which is about 1,800 new cops into the region along the border per year, I mean, per every day along that region, and probably in this area about 150 to 200. It has done very little to stem the flow of immigration. So let's be clear about that. You have to spend billions and billions more. But let's talk about the $10 billion that he spent that's extra money out of our budget. He has plussed up the border, bought gunboats, bought fancy guns for these people, bought planes, all on no-bid contracts, political stunt after political stunt in the year leading up to this with regard to Operation Lone Star. 4 National Guardsmen dead, 1 drowned in the water because apparently Greg Abbott, in all of his no-bid contracts, didn't have a deal with the guy that sold life preservers. Now let's fast forward to Uvalde. Every one of those officers of the 91 that appeared were all from the Operation Lone Star Task Force, the majority, according to the testimony of Steve McCraw in my cross-examination of them. It's important because, as you suggest, they show up with military-grade paramilitary equipment, supposedly, you know, in their flap jackets and their helmets. You see them on the camera. You see one of them in that hallway is a Texas Ranger. They call him a special agent. On the back of his vest, it says Texas Ranger. He's being followed by a game warden. That's the guy with the red schematic. And that gentleman is in there walking around on the phone 10, 15, 20 minutes, just walking around, doing nothing. I want to know, Amy, who that guy is talking to. I want to know who his supervisors are at every level up the food chain. At what point does Steve McCraw, who's been the greatest critic of every other law enforcement entity in this thing, what does he know when, and why does he not tell his force to act? And that is the biggest hypocrisy of all of this, is that in all of this, the big bad Operation Lone Star Task Force failed these children in Uvalde. They failed them. And they have to come to terms with that. And this governor has to come to terms with this.
And Senator Gutierrez, speaking of the governor, his failure to attend any of the funerals of the victims of this massacre and to be able to, in one way or another, have human contact with the victims. Could you talk about that as well?
Greg Abbott came in on the second day, came back on the 29th. Which was Friday, and started telling these mayors, the mayor and the county judge, we had a press conference specifically on the resources that the state of Texas has to offer. And then he came back one more time. Yesterday I said that the Friday visit was his last visit. Came back when the president came on Sunday. Since then, he had not been back to the city of Uvalde. Yesterday, he put out a statement that he'd been to the region. Yeah, he went to the region for sure. He went to the county just south, Maverick County. He had a press conference on what else? Operation Lone Star, on the invading horde of, immigrants that the boogeyman that he's created for Texas, while he is continuing to neglect all of rural Texas. Now, he has, not only has he not been there, not only has he not been to a single funeral, they have botched up their resource allocation of benefits, VOCA benefits for families. Families are struggling to pay bills. All of this money that is poured in has not been distributed yet, not at all. Luckily, I think that that's getting fixed by the nonprofits that have come in to administer the larger funds that were poured in as donations. But the $5 million that Abbott put up has been very difficult in coming out. Finally, the governor, the mayor and I, this is a ultra-conservative mayor on the other side of the aisle. He and I get together, we pen a letter to the governor and say, we need you to move the resource allocation to another entity because this district attorney that you gave this to is just not doing a good job. We don't want to cast too much criticism, but she's clearly conflicted in doing her investigation and having a pot of money on the other hand. And secondarily, they just weren't doing a good job. The county came in and gave it to an ecumenical group out of San Antonio, thank goodness. But here we are. If you were the governor of the state of Texas and 21 souls lost their lives in this horrible way, and your police force didn't do its job, what would you do? I'd be down there with the only thing that I could do, with condolences and grief and prayers and thoughts and all of that stuff. But I'd also give as many resources as I possibly could. And that simply has not happened by this governor.
Senator, we only have 30 seconds, but we're talking to you in San Antonio, and I wanted to ask you about the latest on the 53 people who died in that sweltering tractor-trailer truck. Texas Congressmember Joaquin Castro is seeking to protect from deportation the migrants who survived. Apparently, more than 20 members of Congress have joined him in writing a letter to the Homeland Security Secretary that 11 survivors are being treated or have been released from San Antonio state hospitals. Your final comment on what happened there and whether you support this call.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, first off, they should be eligible for a U visa status because they're victims of crime. Listen, we're in a situation right now with this immigration crisis that it's an immigration crisis across the world. We don't need elected officials blowing this up out of proportion because it isn't the main problems in Texas. The main problems in Texas are an energy grid that is independent of any other, that killed 200 people under Abbott's watch in a winter storm, that this summer is being stressed beyond belief. It's a communications grid in rural Texas where we don't even have accessible Wi-Fi, where law enforcement agencies can't even communicate together in an effective way in times of crisis. Those are the real things that are happening in Texas, a transportation problem that you can't even imagine. The neglect, they call this the Texas miracle. That's what the Republicans like to talk about. The fact is, Texas is in a crisis of neglect of infinite proportions, and Greg Abbott is doing nothing about it except for the same old smoke and mirror show that we've grown accustomed to from his side of the aisle for many years. I'm hoping that we can do better in time, and I'm hoping that Texas can get back on track.
Texas State Senator Roland Gutierrez represents Uvalde, speaking to us from San Antonio. Thank you so much. Coming up, it's primary day in Maryland, and we're going to look at why AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, has spent nearly $6 million in an attempt to defeat former Democratic Congressmember Donna Edwards and other races around the country. Stay with us.